Can you believe what I am about to tell you? Imagine a place where the stars are not points of light, but shards of glacial ice aimed directly at your soft, unprotected skin. A place so remote, so high, that the very act of breathing feels like inhaling pulverized glass. This is not some science fiction horror show. This is the everyday reality of 4,000 years before the rise of kings, nestled on the brutal, impossible spine of the world, the Andean Highlands. We are talking about 13,000 feet above sea level, an altitude that makes the modern human brain seize up, a place the rest of the world wisely abandoned. But here, 6 millennia ago, a few desperate, fiercely determined families decided to stand their ground. Why? Survival, necessity, and the raw, terrifying belief that they could cheat a landscape designed specifically to annihilate them. Tonight, the stakes are not just high, they are existential. Outside the fragile walls of their homes, the air temperature is plummeting toward a point so low it doesn't just kill, it preserves. It turns flesh brittle and lungs into frosted caverns. The single greatest enemy is not the jaguar, not the rival clan, but the invisible, relentless, crushing force of the mountain night itself. A catastrophe no one saw coming, yet one that arrived precisely at the setting of the sun, every single day. The Great Freeze. Their entire world shrinks down to the size of a single breath, a single, desperately guarded ember of fire. Look closely at this tiny, almost insignificant structure. It is a huddle of dark, unmortared stones, stacked with painstaking effort by hands cracked and bleeding from the perpetual cold. This is not architecture. This is a defiant, desperate plea for life. This is the stone hut, the absolute, final line of defense against the thermodynamic fury of the vast, indifferent Andes. If the stone fails, they fail. If the wind finds a crack, everything inside turns to crystal. Meet Kuntor. His name means condor, but tonight he feels like a worm trapped beneath a colossal boot heel. He is the patriarch, the builder, the man who spent 5 terrifying weeks wrestling these heavy, unforgiving rocks from the earth to create this minuscule dome of safety. He watches his 2 children huddled near the meager fire pit, their faces flickering orange in the gloom, and his heart beats a frantic, icy rhythm against his ribs. He knows the terrible truth. The stone is cold. It is always cold. The stone absorbs the sun's thin blessing during the day, yes, but by midnight it becomes a conductor of death. It sucks the heat directly from the air, from the animal hides, and most terrifyingly, from the warm, circulating blood of his sleeping family. Every minute that passes is a microscopic battle for thermal equilibrium, and the mountain is winning. Listen. Hear that sound? It's not the wind outside. That sound is a high-pitched, almost musical hum. It is the sound of ice crystals forming on the inside face of the roof stones, the sound of the very moisture of their exhaled breath, turning solid and clinging to their ceiling. That is the mountain whispering, telling them their time is running out. Kuntur lifts the thick llama hide covering the door slit. The world outside is black and silver, illuminated only by the aggressive, terrifying brilliance of the stars. The air bites his exposed hand like a starved wolf. This is the moment of maximum danger, the deepest plunge into the zero-sum game of altitude survival. If they don't wake up before the chill truly sets into their bones, the morning will find them perfectly preserved statues. The threat is absolute, and it demands constant vigilance. He walks slowly around the perimeter of the hut, his bare feet padding on the dirt floor, placing his calloused palm against the interior wall. He is searching for the fatal flaw, the microscopic gap between stones, where the wind could knife through and target a sleeping child's head. He finds it, a thin, almost imperceptible fissure, high up near where the roof stones meet the wall. He can feel the icy draft, a needle-thin stream of air that tastes of snow and certain doom. That tiny crack, maybe the width of his thumb, has the power to undo weeks of agonizing labor and extinguish the life force of his entire lineage. His breath catches. This is the moment of reckoning. He has nothing but a handful of wet clay and the absolute, desperate will to live. He begins to smear the clay into the fissure, his fingers quickly numbing, knowing that if the clay freezes before it seals, the barrier is broken. The stone hut, their masterpiece of early engineering, is poised on the knife edge of failure. This is the reality of 4000 BCE in the Andes, a life defined not by grand empires or great battles, but by the relentless, hyper-focused war against cold, fought every night within 4 crude stone walls. The fragility of human life has never been more evident than in this tiny, desperate settlement clinging to existence on the rooftop of the world. And Kuntur knows that tonight the mountain is trying harder than ever to pull them back into the silence. What happens when the earth itself moves, when the structure they rely on begins to shift under the weight of geological time? What happens when the stone, their protector, becomes their trap? Stay tuned, because the story of the first Highlanders is far more terrifying and far more inspiring than any legend you've ever heard. This is where the true resilience of humanity was forged, deep in the frozen crucible of the Andes. The crucible was forged, but the battle itself happens inside walls that were never meant to hold back such fury. Imagine a stone wall, maybe 3 feet thick, stacked not with mortar or modern cement, but with the brutal, pragmatic calculation of survival, one rock leaning just so against another, trusting friction and gravity where engineering failed. This primitive architecture was their only defense against a wind that didn't just blow, but clawed at the very foundation of their existence, a perpetual, invisible giant attempting to peel the roof off their lives. They weren't building homes. They were constructing bomb shelters against the atmospheric annihilation of the Puna, the treeless, high-altitude plateau where nothing was forgiving. The roof, not timber, which was not existent at this elevation, but heavy layers of bundled ichu grass, secured by massive river stones, dragged miles uphill, each stone a sacrifice to the god of stability and weight. The entry was deliberately tiny, a low, smoke-blackened crawl space designed to trap the precious, fleeting warmth inside, forcing them to stoop and humble themselves before entering the fragile sanctuary. If you stood up too quickly, the roof of grass and stone was your immediate, painful reminder that you were a guest in this house of desperation, not a master.
But the stones could only block the wind and the snow. They could not block the truly insidious killer that seeped through every crack, the one that stole the mind before it stole the breath, the thin air. We are talking about 60% of the oxygen available at sea level, a perpetual state of slow, creeping suffocation that the Highlanders didn't understand as hypoxia, but experienced as the constant, crushing presence of the mountain god's heavy hand pressing down on their chests. Every movement was a monumental effort, every thought clouded by the oxygen deprivation that makes complex decision-making feel like lifting boulders with your mind. Imagine trying to run a marathon while constantly holding your breath. That was their baseline existence, day in and day out, every single waking hour a struggle just to maintain consciousness. The only thing that made this possible was the adaptation, the massive barrel chests and the blood engineered over millennia to hoard every single molecule of air like it was the most precious gem in the universe. But adaptation required energy, and energy required fire, and fire required fuel, the most contested resource in the 13,000-foot wasteland. And this is where the desperation truly sets in. At this elevation, there are no forests. There is no easy wood. The life-sustaining flame that kept the ice from claiming their newborns, that boiled the deadly bacteria out of the mountain runoff, was fueled by something truly primal. The dried dung of the wild camelids, the vicuñas and guanacos, which they called taquilla. They didn't just hunt for meat. They scoured the frozen earth for droppings, pieces of dried waste that became more valuable than gold, because gold could not boil water or thaw frozen limbs. The women and children spent grueling hours collecting this highly flammable, slow-burning fuel, sometimes risking confrontations with mountain lions just to secure a small basket of dry taquilla. When a hunting party left the stone sanctuary, it was a profound act of faith, a gamble against immediate death, starvation, and the mountain's relentless treachery. They tracked the nimble, high-speed vicuñas across slopes so steep that a single slip meant a 1,000-foot tumble into oblivion, where the wind would tear the clothes from your bones before you even hit the bottom. They stalked these magnificent, highly adapted creatures, not with powerful bows and arrows yet, but often with simple bolas, weighted stones tied together with strips of leather, requiring impossible precision
and inhuman stamina at that crushing altitude. Throwing the bolus required a burst of oxygen that their bodies could barely afford to spare. If they were successful, the real race began, a desperate sprint against the freezing clock. They had to butcher the animal instantly, using sharp obsidian and chert tools before the glacial cold could turn the meat into an unusable crystal block, preserving nothing but ice. Every single part was utilized. The hide for insulation, scraped clean with stone tools, the bones for needles and awls, the meat meticulously dried and preserved into charqui, the foundation of their winter stockpiles, a high-protein superfood. This preservation technique wasn't culinary. It was the ruthless science of not starving to death when the blizzards hit with the force of a divine judgment that could last for weeks. Inside the hut, the atmosphere was thick with smoke, sweat, and the pervasive fear of the endless, lightless night. The sun, their only true friend, vanished quickly behind the colossal peaks, leaving them in darkness so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like being submerged in frozen black ink, deafened only by the wind's continuous shriek. They listened to the wind tearing at the ichu grass roof, the sound of the world trying to destroy their refuge, and they huddled, transmitting the necessary knowledge: how to chip chert, how to prepare the hides, how to spot the best takia beds, in low, anxious whispers. Every cough of a child was a moment of terror, every flicker of the small dung fire a momentary reprieve. Their entire civilization, their lineage, rested on the ability of that single smoke-filled stone hut to withstand one more winter storm, one more week without fresh fuel, one more night where the invisible oxygen thief didn't claim a sleeping child. They lived on a knife edge, suspended thousands of feet above the habitable world, guardians of a tenacity we can barely comprehend. But even in this frozen, brutal isolation, something was growing, something revolutionary that would change their relationship with the mountain god forever. The first seeds of domestication. The mountain god, that colossal, silent brute of rock and ice, had spent millennia asserting its dominance, ensuring that only the desperate and the utterly resilient could draw breath upon its fractured spine. Every gust of wind was a territorial roar, every drop in temperature a whispered threat of extinction. But the people, huddled inside their fragile stone shells, had begun to whisper back, not with defiance, but with a cunning born of pure elemental need. That whisper was domestication, the ultimate betrayal of the wilderness, and it started with a subterranean treasure: the potato. It was not gold they sought, but the strange, lumpy tubers that grew stubbornly beneath the razor-sharp frost line, a miracle of starch and survival. While the air above was pure venom, the earth, if coaxed and honored, offered a dense, caloric bounty. Imagine the audacity, taking a wild, unpredictable plant, one that held the genetic code of death if consumed incorrectly, and forcing it to yield its lifeblood year after year.
This was the beginning of a war against randomness, a methodical campaign waged with chipped digging sticks and frozen fingers. They were selecting, generation by generation, the tubers that could endure the shocking temperature swings of the Puna, the day when the sun, unfiltered by ozone, scorched the skin, and the night when the air crystallized into instant death. The Andean potato, with its hundreds of specialized varieties, was not an accident. It was a biological weapon forged in the furnace of necessity, each type perfectly suited to resist blight, frost, or drought. But planting these miraculous seeds was an act of profound, desperate faith. The soil of the high Andes is thin, poor, and prone to rapid nutrient depletion. To farm here was not simply to sow. It was to perform a brutal, physical choreography with the landscape itself, moving tons of rock and sediment to create small, protective pockets of fertility. They were not merely farmers. They were geoengineers of the highest, most ancient order, fighting against the relentless pull of gravity and the crushing weight of the environment. Every field was a miniature battleground, marked by the sweat that instantly froze upon the brow. If the frost came too early, the entire caloric investment for the year was wiped out, leaving the family to starve, their stone refuge becoming a tomb. This precarious reliance on a single short growing season amplified the terror of existence. There was no second chance, no neighboring village to bail them out.
The isolation was total. The Andes did not permit easy travel. Every league covered was a vertical punishment. Every journey a flirtation with altitude sickness. That blinding, lung-seizing condition they could only interpret as the mountain god's jealous hand closing around their chest. They lived and died within the visual range of their own small, desperate commune, their world bounded by the peaks that clawed at the sky. Yet, the plant life was only half the equation of survival. If the potato sustained the body, the second great act of domestication was meant to carry the spirit and the burdens of the community. Out on the icy plateaus roamed the wild camelids, the slender, beautiful vicuña, and the rugged guanaco, fleet of foot and impossible to corner. To hunt them was pure chance, a high-risk gamble against creatures perfectly adapted to evade humans in their hostile domain. But some ancient, visionary ancestor among them realized that control was better than chance. Instead of chasing these animals to their deaths, they began the painstaking, decades-long process of coercion, separating the wild ones from the placid ones, encouraging the traits of dependency. This was the genesis of the llama and the alpaca, two creatures that would redefine Andean civilization more profoundly than any stone tool. The llama became the engine of their high-altitude economy, a beast of burden capable of navigating terrain that would shatter the legs of a lowland animal. They were the mobile supply chain, the living proof that these people could transcend the narrow limits of their immediate valley. A llama could carry 100 pounds of dried meat or precious quinoa across passes that scraped the ceiling of the world, making limited trade and therefore limited specialized survival possible. The alpaca, meanwhile, offered the ultimate textile defense against the freezing night. Incredibly fine, warm fleece, insulating the body where stacked stone walls could not. Every cloak, every blanket, every protective layer that stood between a child's skin and the -0 wind was a victory won from the wool of these controlled beasts. They were literally woven into the fabric of survival, a warm, soft rebellion against the mountain's icy decree.
The domestication was not merely an economic shift, it was a spiritual one. The relationship with the wild animals transformed into a partnership with the now tamed herd. The herders, spending weeks high above the village, were no longer hunters seeking to kill, but shepherds seeking to nurture. They learned the moods of the herd, the subtle language of the animals that shared their perilous existence. They understood that the health of the llama was their own health, that the fertility of the alpaca meant the survival of the lineage.
This profound symbiotic bond began to solidify their social structure. Who owned the herd? Who controlled the best grazing lands, often small, protected pockets of marshy ground known as bofedales? These questions introduced new complexities, new hierarchies, and new tensions into the tightly knit, isolated groups. The stakes of internal disagreements were now catastrophic, potentially leading to exclusion. And exclusion at 13,000 feet was a death sentence delivered not by man, but by the relentless, cold indifference of the atmosphere itself. Yet the fear remained. The crops could still fail. The herds could still be decimated by a sudden, inexplicable disease. The mountain god had allowed them this small foothold, this temporary reprieve, but its patience was known to be short, its moods violent. Every successful harvest, every new lamb born, was celebrated with rituals aimed not at claiming victory, but at humbly begging the colossal, breathing landscape for permission to live just one more season, safe within the shadow of its terrifying, majestic power. The tiny stone huts held the future, but the wind outside still howled the ancient, unyielding truth. They were always one blizzard away from oblivion. Oblivion was not a concept, it was the weather report. Every single breath drawn at 13,000 feet was a victory hard won against an enemy far more insidious than the biting cold. The enemy within, the creeping, silent scarcity of oxygen itself. This was the world of the ancient Andean people, a geological battleground where the atmospheric pressure dropped so violently that life itself seemed an improbable miracle, a cosmic oversight the mountain desperately tried to correct. They were building a civilization on the roof of the world, but the roof was leaky, and the deadly sky was always trying to seep in, poisoning the very blood in their veins. Imagine running a marathon just by sitting still. That is the biological tax the body pays simply to exist in this razor-thin air. A debt the straining lungs, working like ancient leather bellows, could never fully repay. The constant gnawing hunger for O2 was a physical and psychological burden they bore every minute of every day. Children born here carried the mountain's mark from their first gasp, their chests deeper, their blood thicker, saturated with the desperate need to capture every fleeting molecule of life-giving air. Their hearts hammered out a relentless, rapid drumbeat, a constant alarm warning them of the invisible atmospheric suffocation that defined their home. This condition, the relentless hypoxia, was the silent killer that stalked the clan, weakening the old, felling the sick, and clouding the judgment of the strongest hunters just when they needed it most. A slight exertion could turn instantly lethal, a simple walk transforming into a staggering near-death struggle if the wind shifted or the sun dipped too fast. Survival depended entirely on maintaining the fragile bubble of warmth inside those stacked stone caves, usually kept barely above freezing. But gathering fuel for the crucial hearth was an Olympian task in this barren, icy environment. There were no forests here, only the stunted, tough ichu grasses, and the prized, compacted, slow-burning treasure they cherished above all else, dried llama and alpaca dung, the sacred takia. This takia was the currency of life, the black gold that fueled their tiny hearths, offering the only respite from the 20-degree temperature drop that happened the instant the sun vanished behind the jagged peaks. A small pile of this precious dried matter meant the difference between a warm meal and a crystallized corpse by morning, between a night of fitful, frozen sleep and the deep, permanent cold. They had learned to burn it efficiently, mixing it with high-altitude mosses to maintain a slow, steady glow rather than a rapid, wasteful blaze. Waste in the Highlands was not just inefficiency. It was a death sentence delivered by the next storm. The huts themselves were masterpieces of minimalist defiance, not held together by conventional mortar, but by gravity, experience, and sheer, desperate hope. They were built deliberately low to the ground, hugging the earth to escape the full, tearing force of the relentless mountain wind, known locally as Waira, which could easily dismantle anything that stood too tall.
The entrance was always oriented away from the prevailing storm path, often so narrow that one had to crawl inside, forcing the body to shed the worst of the cold air outside. The thick, inward-sloping stone walls provided a mass of thermal inertia, slowing the inevitable heat loss to the outside world.
The gaps between the stones were stuffed painstakingly with mud and woven grasses, a desperate attempt to seal out the insidious draft that could find any crack, any weakness, and exploit it with surgical, freezing precision. These were not spacious homes. They were claustrophobic pressure cookers of human endurance, designed to trap the precious heat generated by 5 bodies and one small, smoking fire. If the stone hut was the shell of survival, the domesticated camelids, the vicuña, the alpaca, and the sturdy llama were the internal furnace and the clothing that enabled movement. If the stone hut was the shell of survival, the domesticated camelids, the vicuña, the alpaca, and the sturdy llama were the internal furnace and the clothing that enabled movement. Their successful domestication was not merely agricultural progress in 4000 BCE. It was the single, non-negotiable prerequisite for remaining alive above the tree line. Without their thick, insulating wool, survival was mathematically impossible. That incredible fiber, often 7 times warmer than the coarse wool of lowland sheep, was the ultimate defense layer against the mountain's frigid spite. It was the only armor that worked against the relentless, bone-chilling humidity and the freezing temperatures of the high-altitude nights. The llamas also served as critical, living alarm systems, their nervous movements sensing approaching storms long before the human eye could read the changes in the distant sky. Their low, mournful calls served as an urgent warning. The mountain is waking up. Yet, in this brutal landscape, there was a terrible, mesmerizing beauty. The sky here was closer, darker, and the stars did not twinkle. They burned with a terrifying, steady brilliance, reminding the inhabitants of their staggering isolation. Looking up was like staring directly into the abyss of space, separated from cosmic zero by only a few miles of increasingly thin air. This profound sense of being utterly alone in the universe, watching the eternal ice caps gleam under the cold moonlight, hammered home the fragility of their existence. Every night, the mountain demanded a tribute of fear, and every morning they paid it with their continued, desperate existence. But the greatest terror was not the cold that solidified the water in your veins, or the air that starved your mind. The true horror was the blinding, chaotic unpredictability of the Andean weather system, a vast, destructive engine that could flip from bright, searing sunlight to a lethal whiteout in the span of 30 minutes, trapping hunters miles from their sanctuary. They called it the mountain's fury, and when the snow started falling horizontally, driven by 60-mile-per-hour gusts, every single life came down to a simple, terrifying calculation. Had they gathered enough takia? Was the roof stone secure? And would the invisible, creeping altitude sickness finally claim the weakest member of the clan tonight? The ancient battle was never over. It merely paused for a few strained, desperate hours of sleep before the freezing, relentless sun rose again to demand another day of defiance. The sun was a liar. It promised warmth, but its ascent merely sharpened the edges of the frost, turning the stone floor of the hut into a slick, obsidian mirror of impending death. Every breath exhaled by the huddled family was a frantic white cloud, a desperate signal fire confirming they were still drawing air from the world, even if that air felt like shards of crystallized water grinding in their lungs. Old Man Ricard was the first to stir, not by choice, but because the cold itself had become a physical weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to collapse his ribs and steal the last flicker of his life's internal flame. He pushed himself up, the dry, rasping sound of his movement echoing horrifyingly loud in the tiny space, disturbing the fragile truce of sleep that had held the mountain at bay for a few precious hours. This shelter, this crude, masterful dome of stacked fieldstones and frozen mud mortar, was not merely a house. It was a siege engine built against the eternal atmospheric fury. The walls were thick, 2 full layers of rough-hewn basalt and granite, designed to trap the infinitesimal warmth generated by 5 human bodies and the few meager embers glowing weakly in the fire pit.
If a single stone shifted, if the wind found one microscopic crack in the mortar of frozen clay, the entire structure would fail. The high-altitude air, the sentient, hungry predator, would rush in to claim its prize within minutes, freezing blood in the veins and turning organs brittle. Ricard ran his calloused hand along the interior wall, a silent ritual, feeling for the betrayal of moisture, the condensation that meant the cold was winning, the relentless battle of thermodynamics. He saw the youngest, the 3-year-old girl named Anka, curled tight inside the thickest vicuña hide, her face pale, her lips tinged blue. Survival was a constant audit of small, heartbreaking losses. A slightly shallower breath here, a slower reaction there. These were the tax the altitude demanded. Every day was spent trying to pay that tax without going bankrupt in vitality.
But the real war, the true agonizing fight, was not fought with stones. It was fought with fire. Fire was life, the heart of the stone womb. But feeding that heart required unbelievable, sustained sacrifice. Down here, at the roof of the world, there were no easy forests, no comforting stretches of fallen timber waiting to be gathered. Fuel was a rare, precious commodity, guarded fiercely by the mountain spirits and hidden in the most exposed, desolate places. They depended on the yareta, that colossal cushion plant, a biological anomaly that grew at an agonizingly slow pace, perhaps a centimeter per century, making every single chunk of it a piece of ancient, condensed mountain time. Because of its density, it could burn for hours, a solid block of stored sunlight. But harvesting it was an act of brutal desperation. It was like mining stone, requiring heavy wooden wedges, sharp obsidian blades, and immense continuous effort, taking what little strength the high altitude permitted them to possess. Ricard knew they were dangerously low. Yesterday's small haul, gathered painfully by his eldest son, would not last beyond noon, let alone through the impending night. Today, 2 of the younger, stronger hunters, Kila and Waida, would have to venture even higher, staggering towards the eternal snowline. That treacherous altitude was where the largest, most valuable Yareta colonies clung to the exposed rock, offering their dense, crystalline warmth at the cost of frostbite, delirium, and potentially oxygen starvation. Every single step above 13,000 feet was a negotiation with the air itself. The thin atmosphere was an invisible tax collector, demanding excruciating pain for every unit of energy expended, slowing the mind, clouding judgment, and making simple errors absolutely fatal. They lived in a perpetual state of quiet hypoxia, a dizzying, light-headed reality that blurred the line between the painful clarity of hunger and the seductive haze of hallucination. This relentless lack of clean air was precisely why the Apus, the colossal, malevolent mountain gods, seemed so real, so terrifyingly close, their presence palpable in the swirling fog and the grinding stone. Every whistling gust outside the hut was not merely wind. It was the enraged breath of the unforgiving giant, demanding tribute. They had to appease the Apus before daring to leave the protective stones. Ricard carefully uncovered a small, dried offering of llama fat, saved from the last successful hunt, and scattered a few precious traded coca leaves near the door gap, a tiny, silent plea for safe passage and the strength to breathe. The morning routine continued with the agonizing task of warming the hunting tools. The obsidian spear points and scraping tools, cold-soaked by the brutal night, were instantly dangerous to touch, instantly leaching heat from bare skin and freezing muscle. They had to be wrapped carefully in layers of dried vicuña wool and slowly brought to a temperature that wouldn't instantly shatter the hunter's grip or cause permanent damage. Today's primary target, the graceful, impossibly fast-moving vicuña. These smaller, wild camelids were the source of their most crucial resource. Not just the stringy, lean meat that kept hunger at bay, but the finest, warmest wool known to these desolate mountains. A single adult vicuña pelt, if properly prepared and stretched, could mean the difference between life and a frozen, silent passing for an infant during the long, merciless hours of darkness. Killa and Wyra, the chosen hunters, wrapped themselves in multiple layers of hides and tough woven plant fiber, preparing to track the animals across the brittle, wind-scoured Puna grassland. Their preparation was agonizingly slow, a ballet of conserving energy. For every ounce of heat lost now was an ounce of life that might be desperately needed later in the day. The ground itself was deceptively difficult, a deadly patchwork of sharp scree, loose, shifting rock, and treacherous frozen wetlands, known as bofadales. A misstep there meant a submerged foot and instant crippling cold that could lead to amputation by frostbite within hours, a death sentence for a clan dependent on mobility. They knew the vicuñas would be feeding near the low, scrubby mosses, relying on their instinctive alertness to evade the threat. The hunter's strategy was simple, if incredibly demanding. Slow, silent encirclement, moving against the wind, using the natural rock formations as cover, exploiting the animal's excellent eyesight but poor sense of smell. Every muscle ached even before they stepped outside the warmth. The cold was a physical barrier, a wall they had to push through. As Kila lifted the heavy stone slab that served as their door, the mountain air rushed in. Not a breeze, but a violent, crystallized punch that stole their remaining breath. They stepped out onto the high plateau, two small, fragile dots standing in defiance against a landscape built only for stone and ice. The desperate search for food and fuel had begun again. Another cycle of grueling, high-altitude persistence. They were not living. They were executing a complex, exhausting maneuver against the greatest siege engineer in the world, the Andean Cordillera itself. And the clock was already ticking, measured by the rapid exhaustion of their oxygen and the finite supply of heat left in their bodies. The siege was total. Outside, the air itself had become a solid, crystalline enemy, scouring the rock face and howling a promise of instant petrification to anything foolish enough to step into its domain. Inside the crude, low-slung stone hut, the pukkara, the thin line between life and death was shrinking with every passing hour of the endless, high-altitude night.
The cold was no mere discomfort. It was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs and seeking out the critical core of the body, determined to shut down the furious, desperate furnace of human metabolism. Their defense against this cosmic cold was pitifully inadequate. The low, sputtering fire pit.
It wasn't fueled by mighty oak or pine. Those trees dared not grow at this crippling elevation, having been replaced millennia ago by the iron fist of the altitude. Their energy source was takia, dried waste from the llama herds, compressed by the sun, or the thorny, defiant tola shrub, painstakingly wrenched from the frozen soil during the brief, grueling daylight hours. This smoke, thin and acrid, was the only god they could truly pray to, the single source of warmth that kept the blood from turning to sluggish, frozen syrup in their veins. They had to ration it, burning only a single, carefully measured handful of the precious material every few hours, allowing the internal temperature to plummet dangerously close to freezing before granting themselves a brief, flickering reprieve. But the fire, their savior, was also a silent, creeping assassin. To maintain any shred of warmth, they had sealed the single entrance, a low crawl space covered by a hide, and the small, intentional smoke hole at the peak of the rough stone dome was never quite enough to guarantee ventilation. The invisible executioner, known as carbon monoxide, was beginning its work. It was not a violent entry. It was a lullaby of slow, sweet fatigue, dulling the razor-sharp senses required for survival at this crushing altitude. The lack of oxygen, hypoxia, already a crippling condition, was compounded by the rising toxicity inside their sealed stone coffin. The mother, huddled near the fire, felt the familiar dull throb behind her eyes, the sign that the air inside their fortress was turning heavy, toxic, and rapidly running out of the life-giving breath they desperately craved. Yet the internal enemies were only half the battle. The Andean world was constantly shifting, and the walls of their pukkara were under ceaseless, non-stop physical attack from geological forces. The mortar they used, a mix of mud and grass, was brutally exploited by the mountain's cruelest weapon, the freeze-thaw cycle. During the brief, blinding day, water from the melting ice and snow would seep into the smallest cracks between the hand-stacked stones. Then, when the sun vanished and the temperature dropped 50 degrees in an hour, that water instantly expanded into sharp, irresistible ice wedges. These ice daggers were leveraged against the foundation, slowly, relentlessly pushing the critical load-bearing stones apart. Every crack, every shift, sounded like a gunshot in the terrifying silence of the high-altitude void. They lived in fear of the moment the mountain would simply shrug, sending the roof beam a fragile piece of driftwood or scavenged scrub crashing down, burying them beneath tons of granite scree and instantaneous snow. The stone hut, this supposed fortress, was in reality a ticking geological time bomb. The builders of 4000 BCE, driven purely by the desperate mathematics of survival, had stacked the local schist and granite into a dome shape, relying on compression and sheer weight to resist the wind's lateral shear. But weight was exactly what the mountain leveraged against them. Every time the heavy, frozen moisture expanded, it exerted hundreds of pounds per square inch of pressure, seeking the weakest seam. They could hear it, a low, grinding sound, a subtle, sickening shift of stone on stone, like the teeth of a subterranean beast chewing on their foundation. This was not a quick storm they could wait out. This was the long, slow, infrastructural war of attrition waged by gravity and hydrology against human audacity. Kata, the patriarch, kept his hand perpetually on the central roof beam, not for support, but to feel the vibrations, translating the mountain's language of stress and strain into a desperate, minute-by-minute survival strategy. He knew that if the beam, scavenged and dried, shifted even a centimeter, the whole structure could catastrophically pancake, reducing their refuge to a pile of deadly rubble in the freezing dark. Survival here was less about strength and more about deep, ancestral paranoia. They did not rely on written maps or measured forecasts. They relied on the whispers of the mountain, the specific tone of the wind's shriek as it curled around the peaks. Kara could hear the difference between a high-pressure system bringing clear, dry, deadly cold, and the muffled sound of an approaching snowstorm, which, ironically, often meant a temporary rise in temperature, but a fatal loss of visibility. His eyes, perpetually bloodshot from the thin, dry air and the smoke, scanned the low ceiling, looking for crystalline patterns forming on the underside of the thatch that indicated lethal moisture ingress. The cold, now utterly dominant, began to inflict physical punishment even inside the hut. The moisture of their breath condensed instantly on the inside wall stones, turning the rough surface slick with a thin sheet of deadly hoarfrost. The children, already weakened by the thin air and constant hunger, were curled together, their breathing shallow and rapid, a rhythm dictated by the mountain's scarcity of oxygen. Every breath they took was a physical effort, a fight against the reduced partial pressure of O2 at 13,000 feet. The fire flickered one last pathetic time, sinking into the ash bed like a dying heart. The hut instantly responded, the cold air rushing in to fill the void, pressing against their skin like heavy, wet blankets. They were out of Takia. They were out of Tola. The choice was simple, yet horrific. Allow the fire to die, guaranteeing a slow, freezing oblivion, or send someone out into the lunar landscape to face the immediate, wind-whipped terror of the night. It was suicide dressed as necessity. The risk of stepping out meant near instantaneous onset of severe frostbite, and the guaranteed searing headache of the altitude sickness intensifying as they exerted themselves. But the alternative was not acceptable. Kara tightened the hide cloak around his shoulders, feeling the weight of the entire lineage pressing down on him. He was the offering. He was the sacrifice required by the mountain god for one more dawn. He moved toward the entrance, his joints protesting the chilling dampness, his muscles already stiff. He reached for the heavy, flat stone they used as a door latch. The stone felt alien and impossibly cold against his palm, radiating the temperature of the outside void. The moment he unlatched the stone, the mountain would know he was there. And the mountain was always hungry. He paused, drawing in one last, deep, smoke-filled breath, savoring the acrid warmth that was moments from disappearing forever. Then, with a grunt of pure, primal resolution, he shoved the sealing stone aside, and the Andean night exploded into the hut. The true battle for the next 8 hours was not against the cold, but against the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the high plateau. The air did not just enter the lungs, it stabbed them. Every breath drawn from the unsealed doorway was a razor-sharp shard of ice, scraping against the delicate tissue, a constant, low-frequency torture that defined life at 13,000 feet. The sun was still a myth, a promise whispered over the horizon, but the cold was a concrete, crushing reality that demanded immediate, desperate action. Old Kusi, the patriarch, did not need a clock. His body was the chronometer of misery, waking him precisely at the moment the hut's stored warmth finally surrendered to the atmospheric vacuum outside. He shifted, the scratchy texture of the llama wool blankets, their only salvation, pulling taut around his frozen limbs. The first task was always the fire, a desperate negotiation with the mountain gods for 5 minutes of false summer. But fuel here was not timber. Timber belonged to the soft, distant valleys, to the lands of the weak who dared not climb so high. Here only the scrub grass and the hard, dry remnants of puna vegetation existed, demanding hours of labor for a meager flame. He crawled towards the small pit, reaching for the carefully guarded pile of takia, the hardened, sun-baked dung of the vicuña and the domesticated alpaca. This was the true gold of the Andes, not just a heat source, but a symbol of survival, painstakingly collected and dried over days, representing stored energy from a cruel environment. The flame caught reluctantly, a tiny, sputtering victory against the infinite darkness, casting dancing shadows on the stacked stone walls. These walls, deceptively sturdy, were the only thing separating civilization from instant, crystallized death. The stones themselves wept with internal frost, a constant reminder of the world's fundamental hostility, a wet slickness that promised eventual collapse and freezing. Now the water had to be secured. The mountain did not offer running streams in the immediate vicinity during the deepest cold. It offered solid, unforgiving ice, locked away in mineral cages. The children, bundled like small moving bales of wool, were already being roused for the trek to the closest high-altitude spring, which was invariably frozen solid and required hammering. Their small hands, protected by thick leather scraps, held crude stone tools, chipping away at the thick, dark layer of rime ice that sealed the water source like a tomb. But the danger wasn't just the cold, though the cold could kill faster than a jaguar. The danger was the air itself, the invisible, crippling enemy known only as soroche, or altitude sickness, which constantly starved the brain and muscles of life-giving oxygen. Every step taken outside the hut was a monumental expenditure of energy. It was a constant struggle against an invisible weight pressing down on the chest, a chronic, low-grade suffocation. To hunt, to move, to simply exist at 13,000 feet required lungs the size of bellows and a heart that hammered with the relentless desperation of a caged, terrified beast. Today, they needed protein. The dwindling stores of dried meat, charqui, were dangerously low, threatening starvation before the next snow. Kusi and his eldest son, Waira, had to venture out onto the Puna grasslands, a vast, terrifying expanse where the only landmarks were distant snow-capped peaks that mocked their low position. Their target, the vicuña, the most elegant, fastest, and most frustrating creature in the Andes, impossible to catch by simple pursuit. It possessed an eyesight so acute it could spot a pebble shifting a mile away, and a speed that mocked the gasping, stumbling human hunter, leaving them hopelessly behind within seconds. Kusi tightened the sling around his waist, checking the lethal balance of the bolas, 3 weighted stones connected by braided tendon, the signature weapon of the High Plains hunter. This was a weapon of precision and luck, requiring perfect timing and terrifying endurance, especially when the throw itself demanded a burst of anaerobic energy the body simply didn't possess. They left the protective shadow of the stone cluster, and the world opened up into a blinding white-gold landscape under the newly risen sun, reflecting off the ice crystals. The contrast was brutal, absolute shadow cold versus searing, unfiltered solar radiation that burned the exposed skin even as the air temperature remained hostilely below freezing. The lack of atmospheric protection was a double-edged sword, life-giving light and skin-destroying, sun-vomited fire that peeled back the layers of life. Within 100 paces, Waira was already breathing heavily, not just from exertion, but from the simple failure of the air to deliver its promise. It felt like trying to drink water through sand, a maddening sensation of effort yielding no reward. This was the permanent tax levied by the mountains, the slow, systemic depletion of the soul's energy reserve, making every thought sluggish. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest, demanding more fuel than the thin, grudging air could provide. A relentless, internal mutiny. Modern science would later call this chronic hypoxia. To Kusi, it was simply the mountain's curse, a constant, debilitating test only the hardest could pass. They spotted them, a small herd of vicuña, grazing near a sheltered rock outcropping, their golden coats gleaming against the tawny, frost-covered grass. They were magnificent, utterly wary, and strategically impossible to approach directly in this open terrain. This was not a pursuit. It was a strategy of geological patience, a deadly game of chess played at the edge of unconsciousness. Kusi signaled Wyra to split, instructing him to use the low ridgeline as cover, separating their paths to confuse the prey. The plan was terrifyingly simple and brutally effective. Drive the animals toward a natural choke point, hidden by the rising sun, using nothing but relentless, high-altitude pressure and the threat of surprise. For hours they moved, inching across the frozen ground, their progress agonizingly slow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, ragged gasps for air, sounding less like breathing and more like the frantic tearing of cloth. The hunters became ghosts, moving slower than glaciers, yet radiating focused, desperate intent, their very lives depending on the successful execution of this single maneuver. Then, the mistake. A young vicuña startled at a falling pebble, shifting the entire herd's attention, snapping them out of their grazing calm. Kusi knew he had only seconds before the explosive speed of the herd vanished over the horizon, leaving them empty-handed and exhausted. He broke cover, launching himself into a full sprint, a desperate, lung-searing burst of speed. This sprint was a calculated act of self-destruction, trading immediate pain for potential survival. His lungs felt like collapsing paper bags, and the icy air burned down his throat, tasting metallic and sharp. He covered 50 meters, every meter a battle against unconsciousness, aiming for the trailing, less experienced animal. With a final, agonizing surge of willpower, he spun the bolas once, twice, the weighted stones whistling a high-pitched song of death through the thin air, a sound only the prey could truly understand. He released them, and the trajectory was perfect, a low, blurring arc connecting fate with necessity, a prayer answered by physics. The stones wrapped instantly around the vicuña's fragile legs, tightening like iron snakes. The animal went down in a cloud of dust and snow, its frantic struggle muffled by the vast emptiness of the plateau. The hunt was finally over. But the true, terrifying work, the long, heavy, oxygen-deprived walk back, carrying nearly 100 pounds of dead weight, had just begun. This meat meant life for his family, but carrying it, that the Andes demanded payment in agony for every ounce of sustenance. The relief of slamming the stone door shut, a crude slab resting against the frame, was the most deceitful sensation known to the high Andes. The hunter, Eco, dropped the heavy bundle of frozen viscera and fell against the inner wall, gasping not just from the exhaustion of the climb, but from the realization that the battle had not ended. It had merely shifted terrain. The mountain, that colossal, indifferent god, had failed to claim his life outside. So now it began its siege on the very air within his shelter. The primitive stone hut, meticulously stacked by generations of terrified hands, was not a sanctuary. It was a pressurized coffin, trapping the precious thin heat, while simultaneously inviting a slow, insidious death. Every tiny gap between the unmortared rocks became a flute for the wind, playing a high-pitched, mocking song that promised crystallized lungs and the silence of final rest. Even inside, the air was a constant, shimmering threat, a mixture of agonizing cold and the choking reality of survival. Echo's wife, Nara, moved with the efficiency of perpetual dread. Her movements were slow, burdened not just by the altitude, but by the overwhelming knowledge that the fire must never, ever die. If the central flame, the heart of their world, were extinguished, the mountain would swallow them whole before dawn. The great paradox of their existence was the fuel. To fight the frostbite that crept through the soles of their crudely sewn leather boots, they needed fire. But wood was a myth up here, reserved for ancient, inaccessible valleys. Their only salvation lay in the desiccated, fibrous dung of the camelids, the takia, laboriously collected and dried under the cruel sun. It was the fuel of last resort, a blessing and a curse. Takia burned with a deep, sullen heat, but it produced a thick, greasy smoke that had nowhere to go except into their already starved lungs. The smoke was the mountain's secondary weapon, a blind poison that clung to the rafters and coated the insides of their throats with a stinging film. The children, small, shivering bundles of life, coughed constantly. This was the most terrifying sound in the world to Nara, a dry, rattling echo that confirmed the smoke was winning its silent war against the fragile air sacs of her babies. She knew, instinctively, that this coughing was different from the cold. It was the slow consumption of their inner life force. Echo watched his eldest, Kala, clutching her sides. She complained of the terrible stone pain inside her head, a pressure that never yielded. This was the demon of the heights, the cruel spirit that squeezed the brain until sense fled. What modern science would call the deadly onset of high-altitude cerebral edema, but what they knew only as the mountain god reaching a hand through the roof. To alleviate the pressure, they relied on ancient, desperate measures. Chewing coca leaf, yes, but also the agonizing ritual of rubbing heated stones, which often caused burns, against the temples, attempting to physically push the evil spirit out. The knowledge passed down through generations was simple: keep moving, keep chewing, and above all, keep the blood flowing. Because when the blood stopped moving, the mountain had claimed you. Dinner was a meager, spiritual exercise in calorie preservation. They ate mostly boiled tubers, perhaps the starchy, frost-resistant oca, and small strips of dried meat, chewing each bite 20 times vacuum of oxygen. Echo noticed the way Nara moved the food from the cooking pot, a heavy, cracked clay vessel, a treasure beyond measure, to the small stone shelf. Her lips had a slight, worrisome blue tinge, a discoloration that terrified him more than a puma attack. It was the visual signature of the mountain, claiming its payment in breath. He had to ignore it. He had to assume the air was enough. To dwell on the lack of oxygen was to surrender to the panic that stole what little breath they had left. He focused instead on the ritual of the fire, carefully nesting new pieces of takia into the embers, willing the heat to surge, just enough to break the icy grip tightening around their feet. The hut demanded constant vigilance. A single, ill-placed gust, a poorly sealed crevice, a cough that turned into a debilitating fever, or the insidious dampness seeping up from the earthen floor. Any one of these was a potential executioner. Echo knew that even the stone floor, which felt solid, was a conduit for the mountain's malice. The ground itself was perpetually frozen solid, just inches below the surface, meaning the heat they generated was constantly being wicked away by the permafrost, forcing them into a relentless thermodynamic battle they could never truly win. He watched the last flicker of daylight fade through the tiny, high vent slit, a necessary evil to prevent total smoke inhalation, yet a horrifying invitation to the night's deeper cold. The night was not just a lack of light, it was the mountain actively hunting, dropping temperatures with murderous speed, testing the limits of their crude stone defiance. Outside, the Andean world was silence and starlight, a beautiful, horrifying expanse where no human belonged. Inside, there was only the sputter of the dung fire and the shallow, rhythmic gasping of his family, waiting for the sun, the only true ally they had, to return and chase the great cold beast away.